Once we understand the first two noble truths, then the third noble truth becomes evident to us because it works out logically from those foundations of everything being dukkha, impermanent, empty, and unsatisfactory, imperfect, and the second noble truth that all of this together with the craving and attachment to existence, we can then see from these two things what it will be for the cessation or the extinction of suffering. So, in other words, again, think of this in medical terms. We have a disease. The disease is called life. Life itself is the disease. How do we cure it? Well, we have to understand how this disease arises. We need to understand its etiology. And how do we do that? Well, we understand that it all occurs through attachment or craving or tanha. So, once we understand how it arises, now within that contains the answer to how to cease it. Kill craving. And this is why the Buddha says that when you understand that the arising of dukkha, then you also understand its cessation. That the very process of things arising contains within it the process by which things cease to be. Precisely because whatever arises has to come from something, therefore is not permanent, is not something in itself, and therefore is not something that is absolute. It can cease, and its very arising gives us the secret to its ceasing. So the key here is, again, to re-examine the nature of reality. If we look at the five skandhas, at the five aggregates, we saw this circle, didn't we? We saw that the basic experience of our existence in the world is an experience of bodies, feeling, perceiving, thinking, and then coming to understand ourselves, which then allows us to perceive bodies. And if you notice, everything is this conditioned origination, this mutual codependence. The Buddha argues that that's the nature of all the reality we experience. It's a reality of everything dependent on everything else. It's called conditioned genesis because the idea is once you have these conditions, then you have these things. And once you have these things, they become the conditions for other things, and it revolves in a circle. And in fact, the number 0 comes out of the Hindu and Buddhist tradition as a representation of this cyclical emptiness. Because when you think about this and you realize that all of these things depend on each other and it goes into one circle, then nothing is prior to anything else. Nothing is more basic. Nothing is more real. But since everything is a relation that comes about from its previous and coexisting conditions, it follows that nothing has any substantial, ultimate, underlying reality or truth to it. Everything is just a relation. Probably the best example of this is vision, is color, right? When you look at a ball or some object like this Expo whiteboard care thing, you see the color blue. Now that color looks like it's in the bottle itself. It's part of the bottle. And that's why for the longest time, we thought of color as something that's a property of the things that we see as colored. But we realized that actually no, without light reflecting off of these things and wavelengths of light then reflecting into our eyes, there would be no blue color. Blue color, therefore, is something that can only exist with vision. And vision itself can only exist with color. Because if you were to take away vision, you would take away the thing that sees the color. And it's a relationship between the seer and the thing seen. That's what blueness is. You would still have maybe wavelengths of light reflecting off, but you couldn't call them blue because the blueness is what is seen. And so therefore, without vision, there is no color. And without color, there is no vision, because everything you see has to have some appearance to it. And zero color is transparency. And so therefore, we have this example of a mutual dependence, a codependent arising. Vision produces color, but color is what produces vision. Both are the conditions for each other. Think of two cards if you're making a card house. You put the one card up by itself, it can't stand, right? Neither card by itself can stand, but you lean the two of them on each other and they stand. You ask, what's the cause of the standing of the one card? And you say the other card. But that card doesn't stand on its own either. What's the cause of it standing? Well, the other card that's leaning on it. And so therefore you have two things that are mutually dependent and couldn't exist without each other. But the minute they two of them are there together, they condition or produce each other. And that's the whole of reality. So once we realize that the basis of existence, the five skandhas, all are mutually dependent on each other, then none of them have real existence, do they? All of their existence is something that comes from just existing in this relationship of cause and effect. And thus Mahayana Buddhism goes on and says, therefore, not only is the self that we experience empty of real existence, but also all of the things that go into the self. The aggregates themselves are aggregates, are combinations that themselves require other things for their existence. And so therefore, nothing is ultimate. There is no such thing as ultimate reality. Every reality is just a relationship that is produced by other relationships. That is called sunyata, or emptiness. So once we understand this, we understand that everything, even the skandhas, are things that cease to be when their conditions are not there. So how do I kill craving? I killed the things that fuel it, its conditions. And by killing the things that produce it, by taking away the card that holds up the other card, it cannot stand. By taking away the eye, I take away color. By taking away color, I take away the eye. And so all the strategies that Buddhists use to eliminate craving involve concentrating on cutting off the chain of cause and effect, so that when the cause doesn't exist, the effect won't exist either. Craving or thirst or mental formations, the thinking and the desiring, are just the immediate cause of suffering, but they themselves are caused by prior things and so forth. And so the whole idea of cessation is expressed as nirvana. Nirvana being the cessation or the blowing out of craving, and therefore the blowing out of the fire of desire, and therefore the ceasing of suffering. Now, there's one thing that we in our modern mentality don't quite understand, and that is, well, isn't there an easy way to do this? Why don't we just kill ourselves again? If you notice, in all of these negative, so-called negative philosophies, you always have the question of suicide come up. If life is the cause of suffering, then snuff life out and you're done, right? But if this picture is true, there is no snuffing out of life. Suicide will always occur because of our hatred of life or the conditions that we experience in life. And so therefore suicide is itself an action that produces attachment and is a result of clinging to existence by our very fleeing from it. What are we looking for in suicide? We are looking for an escape from suffering. Therefore, we want to experience the cessation of suffering. Therefore, actually, the act of suicide perpetuates the self. That is why Buddhism believes in reincarnation, that death is not the end of this stream of consciousness we call the self, because each new action produces an effect. And just as our bodies produce our feelings, our perceptions, and our minds, like we agree, they argue our minds also produce our bodies. And so it makes no sense that if the fuel is still there and the conditions for the fuel to ignite are still there, that the death of the body would produce a ceasing of the chain or stream of consciousness. In fact, it just should produce a new result, and that's called reincarnation. Now, why might we think that the mind could produce a new body? Well, the Buddhist argument has to do with what a body is anyway. A body is not something that exists independently of the mind. In fact, when you experience physical reality, your experience of physical reality is what produces that reality and the furniture within this reality. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Imagine a statue, okay? Say the statue, a clay statue of Goliath. Now, we point to that statue and we say, look, you see that hunk of clay over there? That's Goliath. Now, by calling it Goliath, I'm calling it a statue. And to say it's a statue, I know how to destroy a statue. I just take the clay and change its shape. I crunch it together. And when I do that, I destroy Goliath. So if I call it a statue, then Goliath can be destroyed by changing its shape. By defining that hunk of reality as a statue, therefore, I define what it means to destroy it or produce it. But do I destroy the clay when I destroy Goliath in this way? Obviously not. So if I said, well, you know, that Goliath is just that hunk of clay in a certain shape, then by changing the shape, I don't destroy the clay, do I? So that same segment of reality, if I call it Goliath, then changing its shape destroys it. But if I call it the hunk of clay, then changing its shape doesn't destroy it. It's the same hunk of reality, but now, depending on how I define it, it will be a different thing with different persistence conditions, with different ways of surviving. So depending on how my concepts divide reality, I'm going to have a different reality, am I not? If I call that hunk a hunk of clay, then it's a different thing than calling it Goliath, the statue. But we also see another way, in modern terms, that this is the case, that mind produces reality, literally. And this comes from advances in science that Buddhists, modern Buddhists, have taken advantage of in explaining the notion how mind can produce body. Let's realize that, of course, our bodies contain our brains, and our brains are what produce our consciousness. And so we could say our bodies produce our mind, and then what? Well, then our minds become curious, right? We come to a certain state and we want to know the nature of who we are. So we examine reality and we find that our bodies are made up of atoms, right? And atoms of subatomic particles, electrons, protons, neutrons, quarks, all of these things. But then we have discovered that the subatomic reality has this paradox to it, that it is both of the nature of a particle and of a wave. Now, this is really important. A wave is something that's spread out and has no particular position. And a particle is something that is located and has a particular position. So the two seem contradictory to each other, don't they? So, but what we found is that when we measure reality, when we measure the subatomic realm and treat it as a wave, then those subatomic particles stop acting like particles, but more like waves. This is especially true at light. But when we then take that same reality, that subatomic reality, and treat it like a particle, then it starts to act like a particle and not like a wave and have particular position. This is the essence of Heisenberg's principle of uncertainty, that whenever I seek to measure the momentum of a particle, I can no longer measure and get precise about its position. But whenever I seek to measure the position of a particle, I can no longer measure or get precise about the momentum of a particle, of a subatomic particle. And what we discovered is that actually this is not a problem with us interfering with the reality so that we can't get at this hidden variable. It's rather that The subatomic realm has neither position nor wave-like characteristics until it's measured. So thus, it's measurement that produces the reality in subatomic realm. The mind produces the subatomic, but the body is produced or conditioned by the subatomic realm. It's a bunch of subatomic stuff all together. And so what do we see? We see that body produces mind, mind produces measurement, measurement produces the subatomic reality that we observe, which produces body. And so what do we see? We see that reincarnation is not something that's against science or our understanding of the relationship between mind and matter. In fact, mind produces matter and matter produces mind, codependence. And so it makes absolute sense that if I'm still attached to existence, that existence, that I am, is going to produce a new body. And therefore, suffering cannot end by just simply killing yourself. So then how can it end? We can only end through realization of the nature of the emptiness of all these things. That realization produces the cessation. But we have to be very careful what we mean by nirvana. Nirvana is not some new heaven. It's not even a new state. In our next segment, we'll talk more clearly about what nirvana is and is not, as far as we can talk about it anyway.